President Trump is at it again. And this time, he went straight for the jugular. Late on a Monday night, he looked at a single, terrifying headline about Canada's economy falling apart, skipped right past any actual policy, and typed 2 words on social media that were designed to humiliate an entire nation. 51 state, he hit post. And just to make sure nobody up here missed the insult, the US ambassador to Canada immediately reshared it, amplifying the threat across the border. You would expect panic, right? You would expect Ottawa to scramble, or at least issue some carefully worded, weak diplomatic statement. But less than 24 hours later, the Premier of Ontario fired back. And he didn't use a catchy political slogan. He used a number, one specific, brutal piece of data that completely derailed the narrative coming out of Washington. Hold on to this number for the next few minutes, because it is the key to everything. Sisher R. Ling ling ling. That is how many jobs one single Canadian province added in a single month, during the exact same stretch when the international headlines were screaming that our economy had collapsed. By the end of this video, that one number is going to look very, very different than the doomsday story you were handed this week. Because if you live in Canada, what I'm about to show you is not just political theater. This isn't some distant exchange of playground insults between politicians that you'll forget by Friday. This is about your groceries, your mortgage, your job, and whether the story being aggressively pushed about our economy actually matches the hard data underneath it. The gap between the terrifying headline and the actual receipts is wider than you could possibly imagine. So, let's get into what really happened, because the sequence of events is wild. On May 29th, Statistics Canada released its first quarter GDP report. And the number triggered a word that travels faster than anything else in the financial world. Recession. Real GDP had contracted by 1% on an annualized basis in the first quarter of 2026. And that came right after a revised 1% annualized decline in the final quarter of 2025. 2 consecutive negative quarters, by the most common definition, and the one that headline writers absolutely love to weaponize. That is a technical recession. It's Canada's first since the early chaotic pandemic, months of 2020. That was the headline that flashed across every screen in North America. And within 72 hours, it had been picked up, spun, and turned into a political weapon aimed straight at our national sovereignty. But wait, because this is where things get genuinely interesting. This is the part that got completely buried in the noise. I want you to look closer at that exact same economic report. On a quarter-over-quarter basis, the agency said growth was essentially unchanged. GDP measured by industry actually rose by 1%. Services producing industries grew by 3%, completely offsetting a drop on the goods side. So, what was the single biggest drag on the quarter? What actually caused this so-called recession? A massive surge in imports. And roughly half of it was driven by gold purchases. Think about that for a second. Here is the mechanical part of economics that most people never learn. But you need to know it today. Imports actually subtract from GDP in the mathematical formula. So, a massive wave of gold buying didn't shrink the real Canadian economy by a single job. It didn't shut down factories. It just pulled the headline number into the red on a piece of paper. That is not a collapsing economy. That is an accounting story wearing a very scary Halloween costume. I almost didn't lead with that highly technical detail. But then I realized it is the absolute key to the entire story. Because for decades, Canada's entire economic conversation has run through one single massive channel: our relationship with the United States. Roughly 3/4 of everything we produce and export goes south of the border. Let's be honest with ourselves. That is not a partnership. That is a heavy dependency. And when one single country holds that much of your export market hostage, you don't just trade with them. You absorb their political mood swings. Every tariff threat, every late-night social media post, every 51st state jab lands on a Canadian economy that is structurally wired to feel the pain. So, when the President of the United States sees a soft Canadian data point and immediately reaches for the annexation line, he's not just improvising for his fans. He is deliberately testing a pressure point that he believes exists. He wants to see if we break. The real question worth asking today is whether that pressure point is actually as soft as Washington assumes, or whether the foundation underneath Canada has quietly been changing while nobody was looking. Because a country that is genuinely cornered, a country that is truly on the brink of economic collapse, doesn't usually answer a taunt from a superpower with a surprisingly strong jobs report. It answers with blind panic. And panic is exactly what we did not see this week. What we saw was the Premier of Ontario step up to the microphone and respond with a line that is now echoing everywhere. Canada's not for sale. It was simple. It was firm. But then he did something so much more calculated. He attached a statistic to the defiance. He claimed that in April, Ontario created 680% more jobs than the entire United States of America on a population-adjusted basis. I had to read that twice to make sure I wasn't missing something. That number does a massive amount of heavy lifting, and I promise you we are going to put it under a microscope in a second. But the move itself tells you everything you need to know about the changing psychology up here. He didn't answer an insult with a cheap insult. He answered it with data, or at least with a number dressed up to look like a devastating counterpunch. Remember, this is the exact same Premier who, just months ago, brushed off the 51st state idea as a backhanded compliment and pitched a Fortress America-Canada partnership instead. But now, the tone has significantly hardened. That shift is a massive signal of where the Canadian mood has gone. We are done playing nice. And here is what makes this moment genuinely worth your time. The exact same week, the terrifying word recession hit every front page. The actual boots-on-the-ground labor data was pointing somewhere else entirely. The contraction in that first quarter report came alongside a 1% drop in exports and a 6% decline in business investment. Both of those drops are heavily, undeniably tied to one specific thing: total uncertainty about what the U.S. trade relationship is going to look like under this administration. Sit with that reality for a moment. The exact same neighbor who is right now publicly taunting us about having a recession is, through their own manufactured chaos and tariff threats, partly responsible for the very economic weakness he is mocking. The pressure campaign from Washington and the soft Canadian data are not two separate stories. They are the exact same story. And one is intentionally feeding the other. That is the critical connection almost nobody in the mainstream media made this week. And once you see it, it changes how you read this entire geopolitical standoff. But before we crown ourselves the victors, we need to put that 680% job creation figure under the bright lights. Because this channel does not survive on feeding you numbers that fall apart the second you poke them. How do you get 680%? It depends entirely on population-adjusted math. In raw, unspun terms, Statistics Canada reported Ontario employment rose by roughly 42 in April. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reported the American economy added about 115 non-farm jobs in that same month. On the surface, the American number is obviously bigger, but Ontario has roughly 16 million people, while the United States has roughly 340 million. They are more than 20 times larger. When you scale each job gain to the size of the population it came from, Ontario's 42 000 jobs represent a vastly larger share of its workforce than 115. 000 jobs do for a massive country, 20 times its size. Run that exact ratio. And you land in the neighborhood of that viral 680% headline. So, is the number fake? Absolutely not. Is it a perfectly clean, neutral, apples to apples comparison? Also no. It is a brilliant rhetorical flourish built on a real underlying gap. And I would rather tell you that honestly than pretend a politician's tweet is a peer-reviewed academic study. If you came here for mindless cheerleading, you are on the wrong channel. But if you came here for the real picture, stay with me. Because the real picture is actually vastly stronger than the political slogan. Here is the truth that survives the fact check. While the national headline screamed recession, Ontario was busy adding tens of thousands of real jobs. Two different scoreboards are telling two completely different stories about the exact same economy. On the GDP scoreboard, the market's recession alarm is ringing at maximum volume. But on the second scoreboard, the one measuring jobs, household spending, and the real grind of daily economic life. The case for a collapse is incredibly weak. One says contraction. The other says the labor market is bending. But it is definitely not breaking, and a lot of people don't want to admit this next part. But a huge chunk of this so-called recession was actually done on purpose. According to the chief economist at one of Canada's largest banks, the weakness was largely driven by a surprise decline in government spending and investment. Read that again. For several quarters, heavy government spending had been artificially propping up growth. In the first quarter, that floor was intentionally pulled away. So, a meaningful chunk of this technical recession is the direct, mechanical result of a government finally, deliberately winding down its own spending. When you stop pumping billions of dollars in, the headline number dips. That's not a mystery. That's basic arithmetic. And it explains why the Prime Minister's response to the recession label wasn't denial or panic. He stayed measured. Almost deliberately boring. Talking about foundations and warning that data would be uneven as his government reduces both rapid immigration and government spending. You can read that as spin, or you can read it as strategy. Central bankers are trained to tolerate short-term pain for structural gain. The discipline that looks like political weakness on a Tuesday is often what looks like economic foresight a year later. Contrast that with the Premier of Ontario, who threw the heavy, combative punch. Provincial bravado versus federal restraint. I will push back hard on anyone who calls that federal tone weakness. There is a version of leadership that meets a bully's taunt by raising the temperature. And there is a version that simply refuses to let the other side set the emotional terms of the negotiation. The person who stays calm in a negotiating room usually holds far more cards than the person screaming across the table. But I have to be fair here, because that is the only way this analysis holds weight. The underlying Canadian economy does have a real, undeniable problem. Business capital investment just fell for a fifth consecutive quarter. 5 straight quarters of companies hesitating to spend money in Canada. That is not a gold import quirk. That is real fear, tracing directly back to Washington. So when the US applies pressure, it carries a very real cost. It freezes the investment decisions that build our future. But just as the doomsayers started taking victory laps, the people whose entire job is to call recessions lined up on the record to say this one barely even qualifies. The Bank of Canada itself stepped up. The senior deputy governor told a parliamentary committee that the very fact you have to put the word technical in front of this recession basically tells you to look past it. The early flash estimate for April GDP already shows a rebound. The private sector economists piled on, calling it a trade-induced technical recession that was most likely already over. The people who are professionally paid to be the absolute pessimists in the room were the ones telling everyone to calm down. And that leads to the single most consequential thing in this entire story. And it is not the 51st state jab. It is what the Bank of Canada does next with your money. If the economy keeps flashing strain, interest rate cuts are coming. That flows directly into your mortgage renewal, your line of credit, and your car loan. If the April rebound holds strong, the bank holds steady. The Washington headline is loud, completely theatrical, and ultimately forgettable. The rate decision made in Ottawa is quiet, permanent, and will show up on your bank statement for years. Step back from this noisy week and look at the massive structural game being played. The 51st state threat only works if Canada is economically cornered. The most important long-term question isn't how sharply Ottawa fires back at a taunt on social media. It is whether Canada is aggressively widening its global options fast enough to make the taunt completely irrelevant. Every export market we add in Europe or Asia, every dollar of investment that chips away at our single point of failure reliance on one unpredictable neighbor genuinely shifts the power dynamic. We absolutely have vulnerabilities. 3/4 of our exports flowing to one country is a massive risk. But look at the whole ledger. An economy that adds 42,000 jobs in a single province during its supposed recession, whose consumers are still spending heavily, and whose own central bank is waving off the panic, is not an economy on its knees. It is an economy being told it is weak by a neighbor who desperately needs us to believe it. So, when the most powerful man in the world looks north, sees a soft headline, and types 2 insulting words, and the answer that comes back is a rock-solid jobs report, that tells you exactly who actually felt the need to make noise this week. That is not weakness. That is a country that decided right here and right now that it did not have to flinch. So here is my question to you, and I genuinely want to know where you stand on this. When the terrifying Washington headline says one thing, but the hard Canadian data underneath it says something entirely different, which one are you actually going to trust with your future? Drop your absolute most honest take in the comments below, because I read them. And I know for a fact you have strong thoughts on this power struggle. Hit the like button to push this truth out into the algorithm. Make sure you subscribe so you never miss what's actually happening behind the headlines. And I'll see you in the next one.